In the summer of 1874, 300 hooded riders surrounded the home of a black widower named Elias Mercer, convinced they were about to drag out an old carpenter with no one left to defend him. They formed a full circle around his cabin, blocking every exit, shouting orders with the confidence of men who believed their numbers were enough to erase him before sunrise. Not one of them realized the traps built into his floorboards were military-grade, or that the man they were cornering had dismantled entire Confederate ambush companies during the war. By the time daylight touched that yard, the riders were begging to know how their own plan had turned against them, how their march toward an easy victory ended with their leaders exposed, their horses scattered, and their weapons useless. What did Elias Mercer do inside that burning cabin? And why did 300 men swear they saw something they refused to speak of again? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The cicadas sang their nightly hymn as Elias Mercer drove the final nail into the porch board. The hammer's echo faded into the humid Alabama darkness. He straightened slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back, the kind of pain that reminded a man he was 55 years old and not getting any younger. The replaced board fit perfectly with the others, a testament to decades of carpentry work that had kept his hands busy and his mind occupied since the war ended. Elias wiped sweat from his brow with a worn handkerchief. The August heat clung to everything, even this late in the evening. His small homestead sat at the edge of the Reconstruction town, isolated enough that most nights he heard nothing but insects and the occasional owl. He preferred it that way. Solitude was simpler than the weight of conversation, simpler than the looks white folks gave him when he walked through town with his toolbox. He gathered his tools methodically, placing each one in its designated spot in his leather satchel. The hammer, the measuring tape, the box of nails, everything had its place, just like Miriam used to insist. 3 years she'd been gone, and still he organized his life according to her preferences. It brought him comfort, these small rituals, made the empty cabin feel less hollow. The porch creaked under his weight as he stepped toward the front door. His boots were caked with sawdust and red Alabama clay. Miriam would have scolded him for tracking dirt inside, would have made him leave them on the porch mat she'd woven from corn husks. He still left them there every night, honoring habits she'd instilled in him during their 23 years together. Inside the cabin, Elias lit a single oil lamp. The warm glow illuminated the sparse interior. A table, 2 chairs, he couldn't bring himself to remove hers, a wood stove, and the narrow bed where he slept alone. Miriam's quilt still covered it, the blue and white pattern she'd stitched during long winter evenings. Photographs were luxuries he couldn't afford, so memory was all he had. Sometimes it felt like enough. Most times it didn't. He moved to the window to close the shutters, a nightly routine he performed without thinking. The forest beyond his small, cleared yard stood dark and dense. Pine trees rose like sentinels, their silhouettes black against the slightly lighter sky. That's when he noticed the lights, faint at first, distant pinpricks weaving between the tree trunks. Elias paused, his hand on the shutter latch. Fireflies, perhaps. But fireflies didn't move in straight lines, didn't advance with such deliberate purpose. His pulse quickened, a sensation he recognized from another life, another version of himself. He forced his breathing to remain steady, forced himself to watch and assess rather than react. The lights multiplied, dozens, then scores, then hundreds of small flames carried on poles, moving through the darkness in coordinated formation. As they emerged from the tree line, Elias saw the riders. White robes gleamed in the lantern light. Hoods covered faces. 300 men, maybe more, spreading out in a wide circle that slowly, methodically, tightened around his homestead. The chanting began low, almost like a rumble of distant thunder. Then it grew louder. individual voices merging into a unified roar of accusation and threat. Thief! Devil! Hiding what ain't his. Elias stepped back from the window. His soldier's mind took over, cataloging details with cold precision. 300 riders meant they'd organized this carefully. The coordination spoke of planning, of leadership. This wasn't spontaneous rage. This was orchestrated. He moved through the cabin quickly, extinguishing the lamp first. Darkness was an advantage. He knew every inch of this cabin, every board, every corner. They didn't. He barricaded the front door with the heavy oak bar he'd installed years ago, then moved to secure the back entrance. The windows received similar treatment, shutters latched from inside, reinforced with crossbeams he'd built into the frames. His hands didn't shake. That surprised him. 3 years of peaceful carpentry. 3 years of trying to be the man Miriam wanted him to be, and still his body remembered this feeling. The cold calculation, the absence of panic, the transformation from civilian to something else entirely. Outside, the mob's chanting grew more specific. A boy's name, Thomas Whitfield. Accusations that Elias was hiding him, that he'd spirited away some white teenager for unspeakable purposes. Lies. All of it. Elias had barely spoken to any white children in this town. Kept to himself, did his work, went home. Through a gap in the shutters, he watched a rider move to the front of the mob. The man sat taller than the others, his posture radiating authority. Even through the distance and darkness, Elias recognized Judge Silas Broderick, the man who'd been pressuring him to sell his land for months, making increasingly aggressive offers that Elias had politely declined. The judge raised a piece of paper high above his head. "By legal warrant," he shouted, his voice cutting through the mob's noise. "We demand entry to search these premises for the missing child." Elias knew what that paper was worth. Nothing. Judge Broderick specialized in creative paperwork, in documents that looked official but crumbled under actual legal scrutiny. He'd heard stories from other black landowners, tales of forged deeds and manufactured debts. "I ain't hiding no child," Elias called out through the door, keeping his voice level and clear. "And I ain't seen your warrant validated by any federal authority." The mob jeered. Someone threw a bottle that shattered against his porch rail. Judge Broderick's laugh carried across the yard. "You dare question the law, boy?" Elias's jaw tightened at the word boy, a man of 55 reduced to childhood by white authority. But he kept his voice steady. "I question a piece of paper waved in the dark without proper service or witness." The mob surged forward. Elias gripped the rifle he kept by the door, unloaded, because Miriam had made him promise never to keep loaded weapons in their home. He wondered if that promise still counted now that she was gone. Then, a single rider broke from the mob's formation. A voice rang out, commanding and familiar. "Hold! I will speak with him first." The crowd parted reluctantly. Sheriff Asa Dalton rode forward on a gray mare, his badge catching lantern light. Elias recognized him immediately. The same man who'd come begging for medical help after the war, suffering from infection and fever. Elias had treated him with the field medicine knowledge he'd learned as a Union scout. Probably saved his life. Asa dismounted and walked toward the cabin door. "Elias Mercer," he called out. "Let me inside. We need to talk. Just you and me." The mob grumbled behind him. Judge Broderick's horse stamped impatiently. Elias hesitated. Was this genuine intervention or elaborate betrayal? Asa had always been decent to him, nodding respectfully when they passed on the street. But decent white men became different creatures when surrounded by mobs. "Alone," Asa repeated. "Give me 5 minutes to sort this out peaceful." Elias made his decision. He unbarred the door just wide enough for Asa to slip through, then secured it immediately behind him. The sheriff stood in the darkness of the cabin, breathing hard, while outside 300 lanterns blazed and waited. Inside the cabin, darkness pressed close. Asa Dalton stood with his back against the barricaded door, his chest heaving like he'd run miles instead of riding. He removed his hat with trembling hands, and the faint moonlight filtering through shutter gaps revealed a face marked by more than physical exhaustion. Purple bruises shadowed his left eye. His lip was split. These weren't fresh injuries. Someone had worked him over days ago. "They're lying," Asa said without preamble. His voice came out rough, urgent. "Every word out there is manufactured fiction." Elias remained still, watching the sheriff with the careful attention he'd once reserved for Confederate patrol movements. "Tell me something I don't already know." Asa dragged a hand across his face. "The Whitfield boy isn't missing. Thomas ran away 3 days ago after his father beat him bloody for stealing whiskey. The boy's probably halfway to Mobile by now, trying to catch a ship north." He paused, swallowing hard. "The judge knows this. Hell, half the men in that mob know this." "Then why?" Elias's question was simple, but they both understood its weight. "Rail expansion." Asa moved to the window, peering through the same gap Elias had used moments before. "Northern investors want to run a line through this territory. Your property sits right where they need the junction. Judge Broderick's been promised a percentage, enough money to set him up like royalty for the rest of his miserable life." Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not fear, exactly. Something older. So he manufactures a crisis. He's been building to this for weeks, spreading rumors, planting stories in the white churches about black men getting uppity, forgetting their place. Tonight was just the spark he needed. Asa turned back to face Elias, and genuine anguish showed in his expression. "I tried to stop it, went to the federal marshal in Montgomery, filed complaints, but the judge has friends in every office that matters. And you came here anyway." Elias studied the man's face, searching for deception. "Why?" Asa's jaw tightened. "Because I owe you my life. Because I'm tired of being complicit in evil. I'm too cowardly to oppose." "Because?" He trailed off, then forced himself to continue. "Because I fought in that war, supposedly to end this kind of tyranny. And every day since I've watched good men pretend it never happened." Outside, the mob's chanting grew louder. Bottles shattered against the cabin's exterior walls. Someone fired a pistol into the air, the shot cracking through the night like a whip. "They mean to come in regardless," Asa said. "The warrant's fake, but they'll claim they were acting on official authority. Anyone who dies," his voice broke slightly, "anyone who dies will be ruled justified by Judge Broderick's court." Elias moved to the table and sat down heavily. For a long moment, he said nothing. Outside, 300 men bayed for blood. Inside, 2 men who'd fought on the same side of a war faced the reality that the war had never truly ended. "There's something you should know," Elias finally said. He stood and walked to the corner of the cabin where his narrow bed sat. With practiced efficiency, he pulled the bed frame aside, revealing floorboards that didn't quite match the others. He pried them up. Beneath was a shallow space, carefully constructed. Inside lay objects Asa recognized from the war. A Union Scouts field kit, battered but meticulously maintained. A cavalry saber with an edge that gleamed even in darkness. Leather pouches containing God knew what. And a folded uniform, the sergeant's stripes still visible, despite years of storage. "During the war," Elias said quietly, "I went by a different name in official records. But the Confederate soldiers who survived encounters with my unit called me something else." He looked up at Asa. "They called me the Ghost." Asa's face went pale. "That's not possible." The Ghost was a legend. Stories scared soldiers told around campfires about some Union demon who could— He stopped, staring at Elias with new understanding. "Sweet Jesus, it was you! Sergeant Elias Mercer, 3rd U.S. Colored Troops, attached to counter-guerrilla operations. Elias's voice remained level, but something had shifted in his posture. The quiet carpenter had receded, revealing edges of the soldier beneath. 47 confirmed disruptions of Confederate supply lines. 63 successful reconnaissance missions behind enemy positions. I could move through hostile territory for weeks without detection. They said you killed hundreds. They exaggerated. Elias replaced the floorboards carefully. But I disabled enough Confederate ambush companies that Sherman himself wrote me a commendation. After Appomattox, I disappeared, changed my name slightly, moved to territories where nobody knew my face. Because every time someone recognized me, people died. Old enemies seeking revenge, former allies wanting me for new wars. I just wanted peace. Asa backed against the wall, his mind clearly racing. Those men out there have no idea what they're threatening. No, Elias agreed. They see an aging Negro carpenter. Easy prey. You could... Asa gestured helplessly at the hidden cache. You could slaughter half that mob before they understood what was happening. I could. Elias's voice hardened. But my wife made me promise never to take another life after the war ended. I gave her my word. His hands clenched. And she's been dead 3 years, and I still can't break that promise. Outside, Judge Broderick's voice rose above the mob. Sheriff Dalton, your time's expired. Come out, or we're coming in. Asa straightened his shoulders. Decision crystallized in his expression, fear still present but overridden by something stronger. Let me try to disperse them. I'll tell them about the boy, about the judge's scheme. There are decent men in that crowd who'll listen to reason. They'll kill you, Elias said flatly. Maybe. Asa picked up his hat, settling it back on his head despite his shaking hands. But maybe they'll listen to a white man with a badge. Maybe I can appeal to whatever conscience they've got left. He met Elias's eyes. I have to try. Because if I don't, I'm just another coward who let this evil happen. Elias wanted to argue. Wanted to tell this foolish, brave man that mobs didn't listen to reason. But he also understood the need to try, the desperate human requirement to believe redemption was possible even when all evidence suggested otherwise. He unbarred the door. Asa stepped out into the lantern light, raising both hands in a gesture of peace. "Listen to me," he shouted. "All of you, listen!" The mob's roar diminished slightly. Elias watched through the shutter gap, his body tense. "There's no missing boy," Asa's voice carried across the yard. "Thomas Whitfield ran away from home after his father beat him. Judge Broderick knows this. He's using you for—" The first rock struck Asa's shoulder. He staggered but kept talking. "He's using you to seize this man's property for rail investor. The warrant's forged. This whole thing is—" Another rock hit his temple. Blood sprayed. Asa went to one knee. Judge Broderick's voice cut through the chaos. "The sheriff's been compromised. He's protecting a criminal." The mob surged forward. Men grabbed Asa, dragging him down. Fists rose and fell. Boots kicked. Asa's cries for reason dissolved into gasps of pain. Elias watched through the gap, his knuckles white against the shutter frame. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to become the ghost again, to paint that yard red with the blood of men who beat a decent person for speaking truth. But he'd made a promise, and Asa was already disappearing beneath the mob's fury. Asa's body went limp beneath the mob's boots. Elias watched through the shutter gap until he couldn't anymore. He stepped back into the cabin's interior, his breathing controlled despite the rage building in his chest. Negotiation was dead. The carpenter's tools still lay on the table where he'd set them before supper. A level, a hand plane, a tin of nails, simple instruments of creation, now surrounded by the howling of men intent on destruction. Elias looked at these tools for a long moment, acknowledging what was about to happen. Then he extinguished the oil lamp on the table. Darkness swallowed the cabin's interior. Outside, the mob's lanterns cast shifting orange light through the shutter gaps, creating moving bars of illumination across the floor. Elias moved through these bars like water flowing around stones, silent, purposeful, invisible. He went to the western wall first, where a row of decorative wooden pegs held his coat and hat. He pulled the third peg down at a 45-degree angle. Something clicked deep within the wall's framework. The shutters on that side didn't just close. They locked into iron brackets hidden inside the window frames, transforming fragile wood into barriers backed by metal reinforcement. The brackets had been salvaged from a Union supply depot 10 years ago, smuggled home piece by piece, installed during long nights when grief kept him wakeful. Elias moved to the next wall. Another peg, another mechanism. These shutters featured something different. Narrow slits at eye level that opened only from inside, allowing him to observe without exposing himself to gunfire. He'd designed them after studying the firing ports in Confederate earthworks, learning from his enemies, as he always had. The eastern wall held no windows, but pressing a specific floorboard triggered the release of concealed vents near the roofline. These could channel smoke, misdirect sound, or simply provide air circulation during a siege. They'd seemed paranoid when he built them. Excessive. But Elias had learned during the war that paranoia was just preparation that hadn't been tested yet. He dropped to one knee beside his bed, pulling up the same floorboards he'd shown Asa. His hands found familiar shapes in the darkness. Leather pouches containing caltrops he'd forged himself, their four-pointed design ensuring at least one spike always pointed upward. A canvas sack of homemade smoke pellets, saltpeter, sulfur, and damp wood shavings compressed into clay shells. Rope snares with slip-knot mechanisms he could trigger remotely. A dozen other non-lethal deterrents designed by a man who'd promised his dying wife never to take another life, but couldn't quite abandon the instinct for survival. "I'm not breaking my word to you, Miriam," he whispered into the darkness. "But I'm not dying either." Outside, Judge Broderick's voice rose above the mob's chaos. "The sheriff has betrayed white justice. He's been corrupted by this Negro's lies." The mob roared approval. Elias heard Asa groan somewhere in the midst of that sound, still alive at least, but barely. "That man in there is a threat to every decent family in this county." The judge's theatrical delivery carried across the yard. "He harbors criminals. He defies lawful authority. And now he's turned one of our own against us." Someone fired a pistol into the air. Others took up the cry. "Burn him out! Drag him to justice! Make him answer!" Elias moved to his interior watch station, a reinforced section of the cabin's northern corner where support beams created a natural defensive position. During the war, he'd slept in worse places. Underground bunkers, hollow trees, once in the crawl space beneath a plantation house, while Confederate officers drank whiskey 10 feet above his head. This cabin was a fortress compared to those hiding places, and he'd had years to perfect it. The mob's first coordinated assault began with axes striking the front door. The blades bit deep into oak planks, sending vibrations through the cabin's frame. Elias had expected this. He'd reinforced that door with interior crossbeams that wouldn't be visible until the exterior wood splintered away. They'd get through eventually, but it would take time. Time he could use. Gunshots followed. Pistol rounds and rifle fire punched through the windows, shattering the glass Elias had already abandoned. The bullets struck interior walls, embedding themselves in wood. None came close to where Elias crouched. He'd positioned himself below the firing line, knowing that mob shooters aimed high, imagining their target standing upright like a fool. Elias counted the shots, estimated the number of firearms, listened to the reload patterns. 20, maybe 25 armed men in the first wave. Dangerous, but manageable if he stayed disciplined. He pulled a cord running along the northern wall. It connected to a series of hemp ropes he'd strung beneath the porch during construction, a project he'd told neighbors was for structural support. The lie had seemed harmless then. Now those ropes released. The porch's front section, already weakened by strategic cuts Elias had made in the support posts, collapsed with a groaning crash. 6 men who'd been standing there preparing to break through the door plummeted into the shallow pit Elias had dug beneath. Not deep enough to seriously injure, maybe 8 feet, but sufficient to remove them from the fight. Their screams mixed with the mob's shocked shouts. Before the mob could process what happened, Elias triggered his first smoke vent. He dropped 3 of his homemade pellets into the channel, then struck a match and touched it to a prepared fuse. The pellets ignited, producing thick gray smoke that poured through the eastern vent system directly into the mob's staging area behind the cabin. The smoke wasn't toxic, just disorienting. Men coughed and scattered, unable to see each other, bumping into trees and horses. Their coordination dissolved into chaos. Elias allowed himself the smallest satisfaction. His wife had made him promise not to kill. She'd said nothing about making fools of violent men. The mob's second wave tried the windows. Men rushed forward with clubs and rifles, attempting to smash through the shutters. They discovered the iron reinforcement the hard way, clubs bouncing off with jarring impacts that numbed their hands. Rifle butts fared no better. One enterprising attacker tried to pry the shutters open. Elias had anticipated this too. He scattered caltrops across the window ledges, just inside the shutter line. The man's fingers found the iron spikes. His scream carried across the yard. Still no deaths, still keeping his promise. But the mob was learning. Elias heard Judge Broderick organizing them, directing their fury into more strategic assaults. They brought a heavy log from somewhere, probably the one Elias had cut down last autumn for winter firewood, and began using it as a battering ram against the door. The door held, but it wouldn't forever. Elias checked his remaining resources. More smoke pellets. Rope snares he could deploy if they breached the cabin. A few other surprises he'd prepared for scenarios he'd hoped would never arrive. The battering ram struck again, and again. Wood splintered with each impact. Dawn was still hours away. The mob showed no signs of exhausting themselves, and Elias realized with cold clarity that this siege would intensify before it ended. They'd bring fire eventually. They always did. He pressed his back against the support beam in his watch station, steadying his breathing. His hands didn't shake. His heart rate remained controlled. After all these years, his body still remembered how to exist in combat. Outside, 300 men howled for his blood, while beating their clubs against trees, creating a rhythm of violence that filled the Alabama night. Elias spoke into the darkness, his voice barely audible beneath the mob's noise. "They don't know the war never ended for me." The battering ram struck again. This time the door's exterior planks cracked completely, revealing the crossbeam reinforcement behind. The mob cheered, sensing victory. Elias loaded his next smoke pellet into the vent system and waited for them to make their next mistake. The first hint of dawn arrived not as light, but as a change in darkness, a slight thinning of the absolute black that had cloaked the siege. Elias pressed his face against one of the interior spy holes he'd cut into the shutters, studying the fog that had rolled in from the creek behind his property. It mixed with the residual smoke from his pellets, creating a gray soup that obscured everything beyond 20 feet. Perfect conditions for him. Terrible conditions for a mob that relied on numbers and intimidation. He pulled back from the spy hole and moved to his water basin, a ceramic pitcher he'd filled before the siege began. His throat felt raw from smoke and shouting. He drank slowly, rationing the supply, knowing this could last another day or longer. The water was warm and tasted faintly of the clay pitcher, but it cleared his head. His left forearm throbbed where an ember had struck him during the last assault. When the mob had tried ramming burning branches through the broken window glass, one piece had ricocheted off the iron shutter reinforcement and caught his sleeve. He'd extinguished it immediately, but the fabric had burned through, leaving an angry red mark on his skin about 2 inches long. Not serious. He'd had worse from cooking accidents. Elias tore a strip from an old shirt and wrapped the burn, tying it with practiced efficiency. His hands worked automatically while his mind stayed focused on the sounds outside. The mob was reforming. He could hear Judge Broderick's voice organizing them into groups, assigning positions. The judge was smarter than Elias had hoped, learning from each failed assault, adapting tactics. That made him dangerous. "Oil!" someone shouted in the yard. "Soak the rags in oil and wrap them around arrows." Elias smiled without humor. They were getting creative. He moved to the eastern wall where he'd installed one of his more elaborate defensive features, a series of water basins built into the eaves, hidden behind decorative trim work. Each basin held about 3 gallons, fed by a rainwater collection system that had seemed like simple practicality when he'd explained it to curious neighbors. The reality was more calculated. Elias had positioned the basins at strategic points where fire would most likely be applied. Release mechanisms inside the cabin allowed him to dump water precisely where needed. He'd tested the system during rainstorms, perfecting the angles, ensuring the water would cascade down the exterior walls in sheets. The first flaming arrow struck the northern wall. The oil-soaked rag blazed brightly, catching on the wooden siding. Elias pulled a lever disguised as a coat hook. The basin above that section tipped, releasing its contents in a controlled flood that doused the flames before they could spread. The fire died with a hiss of steam and disappointed shouts from the mob. They tried the western wall next. 3 arrows this time, hoping to overwhelm his defenses. Elias triggered 2 more basins simultaneously. The water cascaded down, extinguishing all 3 fires and soaking several attackers who'd been standing too close. "He's got water stored up there!" someone yelled. "Don't matter!" Judge Broderick's voice cut through the confusion. "We got more oil than he's got water. Keep firing." They were right, of course. Elias had 6 basins total. If they maintained a sustained fire attack, eventually he'd run out of reserves. But each failed attempt demoralized them further, made them question their assumptions about the helpless Negro they'd come to terrorize. A volley of rifle fire erupted from the front yard. Different pattern this time. Not aimed shots, but suppressing fire. Dozens of rounds punched through windows and walls in rapid succession. Elias dropped flat against the floor, crawling toward his interior watch station. Bullets whined overhead, thudding into the back wall. Wood splinters rained down on his shoulders. This was the mob's attempt to pin him down, while another group tried something else. Elias had seen this tactic during the war: fix the enemy's attention in one direction while maneuvering from another. He low-crawled through the narrow space between his bed and the western wall, moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd spent years navigating Confederate territory at night. His body remembered how to make itself small, how to flow around obstacles without sound. The Union had valued him not just for his ability to kill, but for his gift of becoming invisible in plain terrain. Through gaps in the floorboards, Elias heard boots creeping along the cabin's rear side. At least 4 men, trying to stay quiet, communicating in whispers. They thought the rifle fire masked their approach. Elias reached his rear spy hole, a 1/4-inch gap drilled through the wall at floor level, positioned where shadows from the eaves kept it invisible from outside. He pressed his eye against it and counted 5 figures moving through the fog. One carried a heavy mallet. Another held what looked like a pry bar. They planned to breach the rear wall while Elias was supposedly pinned down by frontal gun fire. The rifle volley stopped. The silence felt intentional, timed to coincide with the rear assault. Elias's hand found the rope he'd strung beneath the rear eave last spring. He'd told himself it was for hanging laundry during rainy weather. The lie had been easy, because part of it was true. He had used it for laundry, establishing the rope's presence as normal and innocent. But the rope also connected to a snare system he'd designed after studying a Confederate cavalry trap that had nearly killed him in Tennessee. The mechanism was simple: a slip-knot loop attached to a counterweight system hidden in the crawl space above. Pull the trigger rope, and the loop contracted, while the counterweight yanked upward with the force of a 100-pound sandbag dropping from the roof. The 5 men positioned themselves beneath the rear eave. One began prying at the wall boards, while others stood guard. They were positioned exactly where Elias had calculated they would be. Human psychology was predictable when people thought they were being clever. Elias pulled the trigger rope. The snare loop contracted around 2 men simultaneously, catching them beneath the armpits. The counterweight dropped inside the wall cavity. The rope yanked both attackers 6 feet into the air in less than a second, suspending them upside down from the eave like game animals strung up for butchering. Their screams shattered the pre-dawn quiet. The other 3 men stumbled backward, clubs and tools clattering to the ground. One tripped over his own feet and fell into the mud. Another ran directly into a low-hanging tree branch and knocked himself senseless. The 2 suspended men spun slowly, tangled in rope, shouting for help. They weren't injured. The snare was designed to catch, not harm. But their dignity was thoroughly destroyed. The rifle fire resumed from the front, panicked now instead of coordinated. The mob's discipline was breaking. Elias heard Judge Broderick screaming orders, trying to restore control. But fear was spreading through the attackers like fever. Through his front spy hole, Elias saw men backing away from the cabin, staring at it as if it had become something other than wood and nails. "Ain't natural," someone muttered, loud enough for Elias to hear. "No man moves like that. No man knows where we're coming from every damn time." "He's got spirits protecting him," another voice insisted. "My granddaddy told me about men like this during slave times, root workers who could turn bullets to water. He ain't got no spirits." Judge Broderick rode his horse through the crowd, face purple with rage. "He's just a Negro with tricks. We got 300 men, and he's one. You letting yourselves be spooked by carpentry and rope?" But the judge's words couldn't erase what the mob had experienced. They'd come expecting easy prey, and found a fortress. They'd imagined a terrified victim and discovered something that moved through darkness like smoke, that anticipated their every approach, that humiliated them without ever showing his face. By mid-morning, the fog had burned off, but the mob's numbers had visibly thinned. Elias counted roughly 50 men remaining in the yard. The others had drifted away during the night and early morning hours, their courage exhausted by repeated failures and growing superstitious dread. Judge Broderick seemed to recognize the defection. His horse paced in tight circles while he shouted at the remaining loyalists, "I'm riding to town for reinforcements. Federal men who won't be scared off by a Negro and some rope. You hold this position. Don't let him escape." The judge spurred his horse and galloped down the road toward town, dust rising behind him. The remaining mob members looked at each other uncertainly. Without the judge's theatrical presence, their purpose seemed less clear. Some sat down in the grass. Others helped the men suspended from Elias's rear wall get down, cutting the rope and receiving curses for their trouble. Elias shifted position to get a better view of the front yard. Movement near the barn caught his attention. Something low to the ground, crawling through the grass with painful slowness. Sheriff Asa Dalton. The man was alive, bloodied and moving like every bone hurt, but alive. He dragged himself forward using his elbows, leaving a trail of disturbed grass behind him. His goal seemed to be the barn, cover, shelter, somewhere away from the mob that had beaten him. None of the remaining attackers noticed. They were too busy arguing among themselves about whether to maintain the siege or abandon it before the judge returned with whatever reinforcements he could summon. Elias watched Asa's agonizing progress toward the barn, mentally calculating distances and exposure angles. The sheriff had about 30 more feet to cover before he'd reach the barn's shadow. Elias waited until the mid-morning sun climbed high enough to cast long shadows across the trampled yard. The remaining mob members had clumped together near the road, their attention divided between watching the cabin and arguing among themselves about whether to wait for the judge's return. Their discipline had completely dissolved. No posted sentries, no coordinated positions, just tired men nursing their humiliations and debating whether pride was worth another hour in the Alabama heat. Sheriff Asa Dalton had nearly reached the barn's shadow. His crawling had slowed to almost nothing, each forward movement requiring visible effort. Blood matted the back of his shirt, where someone's boot had caught him between the shoulder blades. Elias studied the terrain between his cabin and the barn. The mob's random positioning left gaps in their sight lines, but crossing open ground remained dangerous. Then he remembered the drainage trench. He'd dug it 2 summers ago to redirect rainwater away from his foundation, running it from the cabin's north side toward the barn and eventually into the creek beyond his property. The trench was only 2 feet deep, but he'd covered sections of it with brush and fallen branches to prevent it from becoming a mud channel during storms. From above, it looked like natural ground cover. From within, it was a concealed path. Elias moved through his cabin to the north wall and eased open a low panel he'd designed for ventilation. The opening was barely wide enough for his shoulders, positioned at floor level where shadows kept it invisible to anyone standing more than 10 feet away. He squeezed through, emerging into the trench on his belly. The brush covering crackled softly as he crawled beneath it. He moved with the patience he'd learned during night reconnaissance missions, where a single rushed movement could mean discovery and death. The earth was cool against his chest, smelling of clay and last week's rain. Above him, the brush filtered the sunlight into broken patterns that camouflaged his movement. It took him nearly 20 minutes to cover the 60 feet to where Asa had collapsed just short of the barn. The sheriff lay face down in the grass, breathing in shallow gasps. Elias reached out slowly and touched his shoulder. Asa jerked, tried to rise, then recognized Elias and slumped back down. His face was a canvas of bruises, left eye swollen shut, lower lip split, nose clearly broken. "Easy," Elias whispered. "I got a path. Can you crawl?" Asa nodded weakly. Elias guided him toward the trench opening, helped him slide into it, then pulled brush back over them both. They moved together through the hidden channel, Elias leading, occasionally reaching back to steady Asa when his strength faltered. They emerged through the low panel into Elias's cabin. Elias secured the opening behind them, then helped Asa onto the narrow bed against the west wall. The sheriff groaned as his back touched the mattress, then forced himself into a sitting position. "Can't let them see me." "Lying down," Asa muttered through split lips. "Nobody's seeing you right now," Elias said. He retrieved a basin of water he'd kept covered and clean, along with strips of cloth he'd torn from an old shirt. "Let me work." He'd learned field medicine during the war. Not formal doctoring, but practical knowledge of how to keep wounded men alive long enough to reach real treatment. He cleaned the blood from Asa's face with gentle efficiency, checked his ribs for breaks, examined the cuts on his scalp. The injuries looked worse than they were. Painful, humiliating, but not life-threatening. "Judge went for more men," Asa said while Elias worked. "Heard him say something about a federal marshal. Someone he's got connections with." Elias's hands paused briefly, then continued cleaning a gash above Asa's ear. "Federal involvement changes things. Everything changes things." Asa winced as Elias probed a tender spot on his jaw. "I should have changed things years ago. Should have stood up to Broderick the first time he manipulated legal documents. Should have protected families like yours instead of—" He trailed off, staring at nothing. "Instead of being too scared to lose my position. You came here to warn me," Elias said quietly. That counts. Does it? Asa's good eye fixed on Elias with surprising intensity. How many black families got driven off their land while I looked the other way? How many times did I enforce laws I knew were being twisted to serve men like Broderick? He shook his head slightly, immediately regretted it, and groaned. You fought for the Union, risked everything to end slavery. And men like me, we just let it continue in different clothes. Elias bound a clean cloth around Asa's ribs, creating compression to ease the pain of what was probably a cracked bone. War taught me something about moral cowardice, he said. Taught me it's not the same as evil. Cowards can change. Evil doesn't want to. Asa was quiet for a long moment. Then, I admire you, Elias. Not just the soldier you were, the man you became after. Living quiet, keeping your word to your wife, building something decent despite— He gestured vaguely toward the shuttered windows, beyond which the mob still waited. Despite all this. Decent men don't have to build fortresses, Elias said. Maybe that's exactly when they do. Outside, voices rose in volume. Elias moved to his front spy hole and peered through. The scattered mob members were standing now, attention drawn toward the road. Dust rose in the distance, riders approaching, maybe a dozen or more. But other movement caught his eye. From the east, a different group was arriving on foot. Townspeople drawn by news of the siege. Elias recognized several faces. White shopkeepers, a minister, families who'd bought furniture he'd built. They clustered at the property's edge, clearly uncertain about approaching the armed mob, but equally unwilling to leave. Among them, standing separate, but watching with desperate intensity, several black families had gathered. Elias saw old Thomas from the mill, Martha Washington, who sold vegetables in town, the Freeman brothers, who worked the railroad. They maintained careful distance from the white townspeople, but their presence spoke clearly. They knew what happened here mattered beyond one man's cabin. The riders from the west reached the yard. Judge Broderick led them, his face flushed with triumph. Behind him rode a lean man in a dark suit, carrying official-looking saddlebag, the federal marshal. Asa struggled to his feet, despite Elias's steadying hand. I need to be standing, he insisted. Need to stop this before— Before what? Elias asked. But he already knew the answer. The judge dismounted and immediately began speaking to his remaining mob members, gesturing dramatically. The marshal sat his horse calmly, surveying the scene with professional detachment. Elias helped Asa to the door. You sure about this? No, Asa admitted, but I'm doing it anyway. They stepped outside together. The morning sunlight hit them fully, revealing Asa's battered face to everyone present. A collective gasp rose from the townspeople. Asa raised his voice, projecting with surprising strength despite his injuries. This siege is built on lies. The boy isn't missing. He ran away from home. The judge fabricated evidence to steal this man's land. I came here to prevent violence and was attacked for speaking truth, the townspeople murmured. Several nodded. The mob members who'd beaten Asa looked uncomfortable, suddenly aware they'd crossed a line even Reconstruction Alabama's twisted morality couldn't ignore. Attacking a white sheriff for defending due process. Judge Broderick's face went purple. This man obstructed justice. He interfered with a lynch mob, Asa interrupted. That's what you brought here, Silas. 300 men to terrorize one citizen because you want his land for your railroad deal. The murmuring grew louder. Doubt spread through the crowd like ripples. The judge's authority wavered visibly, his theatrical certainty undermined by a bloodied sheriff's simple truth. For one shining moment, it seemed the siege might collapse under the weight of its own corruption exposed. Then Judge Broderick stepped aside with a theatrical flourish, gesturing toward the federal marshal. Which is why I brought proper authority. Federal authority that supersedes local sentiment. The marshal urged his horse forward. He pulled documents from his saddlebag, with practiced formality, his voice carrying across the yard with bureaucratic precision. "Elias Mercer, you are under federal arrest for harboring a fugitive minor and resisting lawful search and seizure of your property." The crowd fell silent as Marshal Harlan Briggs unfolded the document. He was tall and angular, probably 50 years old, with iron-gray hair and a face carved from hard experience. His uniform was spotless despite the long ride. Everything about him projected authority, the kind that came from federal backing and years of enforcement work that brooked no argument. "Elias Mercer," he repeated, his voice carrying the flat precision of a man reading charges 1,000 times before. "You are hereby charged with unlawfully harboring a minor child, Samuel Pritchard, aged 14, who fled his legal guardians on the evening of June 7, 1874. Further, you are charged with resisting lawful attempts by duly appointed officers to search these premises and recover said minor." Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. The words were official. The paper looked legitimate. The marshal's bearing suggested he believed every syllable he spoke. This wasn't a mob anymore. This was the law itself, twisted and weaponized, but still wearing the clothes of legitimacy. Asa lurched forward, nearly stumbling. "That's fabricated. The boy ran away voluntarily. He's not even here. This is a land seizure disguised as—" Two of the judge's men grabbed Asa by the arms. He struggled briefly, but his injuries and their numbers overwhelmed him. One produced iron handcuffs and snapped them around Asa's wrists with brutal efficiency. "Sheriff Dalton," Marshal Briggs said, his tone never changing, "you are interfering with a federal investigation. Stand down or face additional charges." "Federal investigation?" Asa spat blood. "You're reading lies written by—" The judge's men forced him to his knees. The marshal didn't even look at him. His attention remained fixed on Elias with the professional detachment of a man who'd served warrants in contested territories, who'd faced armed resistance before, who saw this as nothing more than another job requiring completion. Judge Broderick stepped forward, his face glowing with vindication. "As you can see, Marshal, the suspect refuses to comply. The cabin must be searched thoroughly for the missing boy." "The boy isn't here," Elias said quietly. His voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "Never was. And you know it, Silas." The judge's smile never wavered. "Then you have nothing to fear from a lawful search." Marshal Briggs dismounted with careful precision. He approached Elias, one hand resting on his sidearm. Not threatening, just ready. "Mr. Mercer, I'm authorized to use necessary force to execute this warrant. I'd prefer cooperation." Elias looked at the man's face, saw no malice there, no hatred, just duty, rigid and inflexible, shaped by whatever forged documents the judge had provided. The marshal genuinely believed he was enforcing legitimate law. That made him more dangerous than any mob member driven by hate. "I won't resist," Elias said. Then, meeting Briggs's eyes directly, "But you're being used. That warrant is—" "I don't determine the validity of federal warrants," Briggs interrupted. "I execute them. You can contest the charges in court." "What court?" Elias asked softly. "Presided over by what judge?" Something flickered in Briggs's expression, the briefest hint of discomfort, but duty won. It always did with men like him. Judge Broderick gestured impatiently. "We've wasted enough time with this criminal. Search the premises. Burn it if necessary to flush out the boy." "Burn it?" Briggs turned to face the judge. "That's not standard. The suspect is a known arsonist who threatened to destroy evidence," the judge said smoothly. "I have sworn testimony to that effect." More lies, layered so thickly they created their own false reality. Elias watched the judge work, saw how he manipulated even the federal marshal with practiced ease. The law wasn't being twisted anymore. It was being worn as camouflage by something lawless beneath. The mob surged forward at the judge's signal. Several men carried torches they'd prepared earlier, the pitch-soaked rags wrapped around wooden handles. The marshal didn't stop them. His job was the warrant, not the methods. Elias backed toward his cabin door. The crowd moved with him, sensing victory. Behind them, the townspeople watched in shocked silence. The black families stood frozen, understanding exactly what this moment meant. That federal authority could be purchased. That law itself was just another weapon of oppression. Elias reached his door and stepped inside. He closed it, threw the bolt, heard them laughing outside. Through the spy hole, he watched the first torch touch his porch. The dry wood caught immediately, flames spreading with hungry speed. He stood in the center of his cabin, the home he'd built with his own hands, where Miriam had lived and died, where he'd tried to build something peaceful despite the world's violence. Smoke began seeping through the floorboards as fire consumed the porch supports. His wife's voice echoed in memory. "Promise me you'll never kill again. Promise me you'll build instead of destroy." He'd kept that promise for 10 years, had believed peace was possible if he just stayed quiet enough, small enough, unthreatening enough. But peace required 2 willing parties. One person couldn't maintain it alone. The heat intensified. Flames licked up the walls. He grabbed blankets and began beating at the spreading fire. But there were too many ignition points. The mob had learned from their earlier failures. They weren't trying to burn him out with small fires anymore. They were destroying the entire structure. Smoke filled the cabin quickly. Elias dropped low, breathing near the floor where air still remained. His eyes watered. His lungs burned. The heat pressed against him like something physical, driving him back from the advancing flames. He crawled toward the western corner, where a heavy trunk sat against the wall. He'd hoped never to use what lay beneath it, hoped it would remain a precaution that never became necessary. He shoved the trunk aside. It scraped across the floor with a sound lost beneath the roar of flames. Beneath it, a section of floorboard lifted away, revealing darkness below, the escape tunnel. He'd dug it during his first year here, working at night, disposing of the excavated earth gradually so no one would notice. It ran 60 feet underground, sloping gently upward to emerge in the tree line behind his property. During construction, he'd reinforced it with salvaged timber and created ventilation shafts disguised as rabbit warrens. The opening was barely wide enough for his shoulders. Elias lowered himself into absolute darkness, pulling the false floor closed above him. The last sliver of firelight disappeared, leaving him in earth-scented blackness. He crawled forward on his elbows, the tunnel ceiling inches above his back. The walls pressed close on both sides. Roots scratched his face. The ground was hard-packed clay that scraped his hands raw. Behind him, muffled by dirt and distance, he heard timbers collapsing, his home dying. Everything he'd built turning to ash because men with authority decided his existence was inconvenient. The tunnel seemed endless. His breath came in ragged gasps, the smoke he'd inhaled making every inhalation painful. Darkness pressed against his eyes so completely that he lost all sense of direction, trusting only muscle memory of the tunnel's straight path. His hand touched something unexpected: dampness. One of the ventilation shafts had leaked during recent rains, creating a small pool. He pressed his face against it, letting the cool water soothe his burning eyes. Then he continued crawling. The tunnel began sloping upward. Fresh air reached him through the exit shaft, sweet and clean. He moved faster, despite exhaustion, driven by the promise of sky and space. His hands touched the wooden frame he'd built around the exit. He pushed upward against the concealed door, a section of forest floor disguised with transplanted moss and fallen leaves. It lifted. Afternoon sunlight hit his face. He dragged himself out of the earth, gasping, covered in dirt and ash. Behind him, through the trees, he could see his cabin fully engulfed in flames. Black smoke rose in a column visible for miles. The mob stood in a semicircle around the burning structure, their backs to him. They were cheering. Judge Broderick's voice carried above the rest, proclaiming justice served. The marshal sat his horse at a distance, watching the destruction with what might have been discomfort, but certainly wasn't intervention. Elias knelt in the forest shadows, breathing air that tasted of freedom and failure. His home burned. The law had been turned against him. An innocent man had been cuffed for defending truth, and somehow he'd survived. He remained completely still, watching them celebrate what they believed was his death, and began to understand exactly what came next. Elias remained motionless in the shadows, letting his breathing steady while his mind catalogued everything visible through the trees. The mob had dispersed into smaller groups now that they believed him dead. Some stood near the burning cabin, poking at debris with rifles. Others had retreated to the shade, passing whiskey bottles and congratulating themselves on enforcing what they called justice. Judge Broderick stood apart from the common mob members, flanked by his personal enforcers near a weathered barn that sat 40 yards from the cabin. The structure served as storage for a neighboring property, but the judge had commandeered it as his command post. Elias could see movement through the open barn doors, men entering and exiting with purposeful efficiency rather than the drunken swagger of the general mob. Marshal Briggs remained mounted near the road, his posture rigid. He wasn't celebrating, wasn't joining the revelry, just watching with an expression Elias recognized from the war, the look of a man who'd followed orders and was now questioning whether those orders were worth following. Elias pressed his palm against rough bark, grounding himself in something solid while smoke from his destroyed home drifted overhead. Everything he'd built was ash now. The furniture Miriam had chosen, the table where they'd shared meals, the bed where she'd died, her hand in his, making him promise to choose peace over violence. He'd kept that promise for a decade, had swallowed rage and injustice and fear, believing that restraint was the same as righteousness. But watching these men celebrate the burning of an innocent man's home while hiding behind false warrants and federal authority, he understood something fundamental had shifted. Peace required reciprocity. When one side brought war disguised as law, choosing not to fight wasn't noble. It was suicide. But he could fight without killing, could dismantle their power without becoming what they claimed he was. Through the trees, he saw Asa being dragged toward a wagon, hands still bound. Several townspeople had begun arguing with the mob members. White women Elias recognized from church, a few older men who'd served in the war and understood the difference between justice and lynching. The crowd was fracturing along moral lines, but the judge's authority still held enough weight to keep resistance scattered and ineffective. Elias knew what he needed. Asa had mentioned it during their brief conversation. The judge kept detailed records of his schemes in a ledger stored wherever he operated. Insurance against his co-conspirators, leverage against potential betrayers, the kind of documentation corrupt men created because they couldn't trust the system they'd corrupted. That ledger would be in the barn. Had to be. The judge wouldn't leave it anywhere unsecured while orchestrating something this public. Elias began moving through the forest parallel to the mob's position, using techniques he'd mastered during the war. He stayed low, moved during moments of noise, when men shouted or horses whinnied, never crossed open ground when eyes might turn his direction. The skills came back instantly, muscle memory overriding a decade of peaceful carpentry. He circled wide, approaching the barn from its blind side, where the sloped roof met tall grass. The structure was old, built in a hurry years ago with questionable engineering. Support beams visible through gaps in the siding showed stress cracks. The roof sagged slightly in the center. It wouldn't take much to compromise its stability. 5 men guarded the barn's front, but the rear was unwatched. Elias crawled through grass still damp from morning dew until he reached the back wall. He pressed his ear against sun-warmed wood and listened. Voices inside, muffled but distinct. Someone counting money. Someone else complaining about the heat. The barn's construction was shoddy enough that gaps between boards let him see inside. The judge stood near a makeshift desk, a plank across two barrels, studying papers. The ledger sat beside him, leather-bound and thick with documentation. Elias studied the barn structure with a carpenter's eye. The main support posts were set in shallow holes rather than properly sunk foundations. Several crossbeams had been notched incorrectly, weakening their load-bearing capacity. The whole structure was one strong wind away from collapse. It just needed the right pressure points triggered in the right sequence. He worked silently, using a piece of broken glass to saw through rope holding a critical brace. Not enough to cause immediate failure, just enough to create instability. He loosened stakes anchoring support posts, identified which boards, if removed, would trigger a cascade of structural failure without actually bringing the roof down on anyone's head. The horses presented an opportunity. 12 animals were tethered in a makeshift corral beside the barn, still saddled, ready for quick departure. Elias had trained cavalry mounts during the war, knew exactly what sounds and scents would spook them into panic. He needed smoke, confusion, and perfect timing. From his days preparing for sieges that never came, he'd cached supplies throughout his property. One such cache was buried near the tree line, a waterproof box containing materials he'd hoped never to use. He retrieved it quickly, finding the clay pots of sulfur and charcoal mixture still intact. Not explosives, just smoke generators that would produce thick, acrid clouds without flame. He positioned 3 pots strategically, one near the horses, one at the barn's eastern corner, one blocking the main path between barn and road. Then he prepared the triggers, simple friction devices that would ignite the mixture when pulled. The sun had shifted lower, creating longer shadows. The mob's celebration had devolved into drunken arguments. Some wanted to leave. Others insisted on staying to ensure Elias's body was recovered from the ruins. Marshal Briggs had dismounted, speaking with several townspeople who'd brought water and food. The conversation looked tense. Occasionally Briggs would glance toward the judge, his expression hardening. Elias positioned himself in the barn's loft access, a small opening used for hay storage. The ladder was rotted, but he climbed it silently, testing each rung before trusting it with his full weight. Inside the loft, he could see directly down to where the judge stood. The ledger was now tucked under the man's arm as he gave orders to his men. Perfect. When chaos erupted, the judge would clutch that ledger like a lifeline, making it easier to target. Elias pulled the first trigger cord. The smoke pot near the horses ignited with a soft whoomp. Thick gray smoke billowed instantly, carrying the acrid chemical smell directly into the animals' nostrils. They spooked immediately, rearing, pulling against tethers, screaming in panic. The first rope snapped. Then another. Horses bolted in every direction, their heavy bodies colliding with men, knocking over supply crates, creating instant mayhem. Elias pulled the second cord. Smoke erupted at the barn's corner, rolling across the entrance and obscuring visibility. Men stumbled out coughing, confused, unable to see who was friend or enemy in the sudden gray wall. The judge shouted commands, but his voice was lost in chaos. He moved toward the barn's rear exit, ledger clutched tight, trying to escape the confusion. That's when Elias pulled the third cord and simultaneously kicked the weakened support post nearest him. The barn didn't collapse. It settled, groaning as compromised supports shifted under the roof's weight. Crossbeams dropped several inches, jamming the main doors shut and trapping men inside. They weren't crushed, just trapped, panicking, beating against walls that held firm enough to contain them, but clearly unstable enough to terrify. Elias dropped from the loft through the rear opening, landing in a crouch directly behind the judge. Broderick spun, eyes wide with shock. His hand moved toward a pistol. Elias was faster. His hand clamped on the judge's wrist, not breaking it, just controlling it with precision born from years of close combat. "Drop it," Elias said quietly. The judge's pistol clattered to the dirt. His face had gone white, all the theatrical authority stripped away, leaving only a man who'd gambled everything and lost. "The ledger," Elias said, extending his free hand. Broderick clutched it tighter, some desperate instinct making him protect the very evidence that would destroy him. "You don't understand what you're interfering with. This town needs order, structure. People like you need to know your—" Elias twisted the man's wrist just enough to make his point without breaking bone. The ledger fell. Elias caught it with his other hand, then released the judge and stepped back, putting distance between them. Around them, chaos continued. Horses scattered across the property. Men trapped in the barn shouted for release. Smoke drifted through everything, turning the afternoon sun into a hazy orange disk. Marshal Briggs appeared through the smoke, pistol drawn, his expression thunderous. He looked at the judge, at Elias, at the ledger now in a black man's possession. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Elias held out the ledger. "I believe this belongs to your investigation, Marshal." Briggs took it slowly, his jaw working as he processed what was happening. He flipped it open, scanning the first page. His face darkened. "Jesus Christ! That ledger contains every bribe, every forged document, every name of every man who helped manufacture tonight's violence," Elias said. His voice was steady despite the exhaustion pulling at his bones, including details of how federal authority was purchased to legitimize a land grab. The marshal's eyes snapped to the judge. "Is this true?" Broderick straightened, trying to recover his composure. "That man is a criminal who—" "Shut your mouth!" Briggs's voice cracked like a whip. He turned to his deputies, who'd emerged from the smoke. "Secure Judge Broderick. He's under arrest, pending federal investigation." The judge's protests dissolved into sputtering rage as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The sound carried across the property, cutting through the chaos. Men stopped shouting. The trapped barn occupants went quiet. Asa appeared, leaning heavily on a borrowed cane, his face a mass of bruises. He looked at Elias with something between relief and awe. "You're alive." "Disappointed?" Elias asked, too tired for real humor. "Relieved." Asa's voice broke slightly. "I thought, when I saw the flames—" "I know what you thought." Elias turned toward what remained of his cabin. The walls still stood, blackened and smoking, but the roof had collapsed inward. Everything inside was ash. What everyone thought. The mob had begun to scatter, men slipping away into the forest like roaches when light hits them. Some mounted horses and rode hard for the road. Others simply walked away, shoulders hunched with shame or relief or both. But the townspeople who'd arrived to witness remained. White women who'd brought water and arguments, older men who'd questioned the violence from the beginning. Black families who'd watched from the margins, terrified but unable to leave. They all stared at Elias as he walked past the barn toward his destroyed home. Marshal Briggs called out, "Mr. Mercer, I need a statement." Elias paused without turning. "Tomorrow. Right now, I need to see what's left." The marshal nodded, understanding in his expression. "Tomorrow. And Mr. Mercer, I apologize. I should have verified those documents before—" "You should have." Elias kept walking. The cabin's front steps had burned through. He circled to the side entrance, testing boards before trusting his weight. The doorframe was intact, miraculously, and he pushed through into what had been his home. Smoke still rose from collapsed timbers. The table where he'd eaten breakfast was charcoal. The chairs Miriam had insisted on buying despite the cost, gone. The bedroom where she'd died was buried under roof beams, everything reduced to ash and memory. He knelt beside what had been their bed, sifting through debris with careful hands. The metal frame remained, twisted by heat. The quilt her mother had made, destroyed. But there, beneath a fallen beam, protected by the iron bed frame, was the small wooden box where he'd kept her letters. He pulled it free. The exterior was scorched, but when he opened it, the letters inside were intact. Her handwriting, her voice preserved on paper. His hands shook as he held them. Footsteps approached behind him. He didn't turn. "Elias," Asa's voice was gentle. "Some folks want to talk to you, if you're ready." Elias carefully closed the box and stood. When he emerged from the ruins, he found a group gathered in his yard. Black families he recognized from church stood beside white neighbors he'd done carpentry work for. Even some of the townspeople who'd only watched from a distance had joined. An older black woman stepped forward, carrying a basket. "We brought food. Figured you'd need something after." She gestured at the destruction, unable to finish. A white man Elias had built a barn for cleared his throat. "Some of us want to help rebuild. If you'll have us." "I know words don't fix what happened, but—" "No," Elias said quietly. "Words don't fix it." The man's face fell, but actions might start to. Elias looked at the assembled group. Some met his eyes, others couldn't. "I'll accept help, but I need to know it's genuine, that it comes from understanding what happened here was wrong, not just illegal. Wrong." Several people nodded. One woman wiped her eyes. Asa stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "I failed you tonight. I should have done more, sooner. Should have stood up to the judge years ago instead of—" His voice broke. "Instead of being a coward. You came when it mattered," Elias said. "That counts for something." "Not enough." "No," Elias agreed, "but it's a start. Accountability comes next. Making sure what happened tonight leads to actual change. Not just for me, for everyone who faces this kind of violence." Marshal Briggs approached the group, the ledger still in his hand. "Mr. Mercer, I want you to know there will be a full federal investigation. Everyone named in this book will be questioned. Charges will be filed where appropriate." Elias studied the man's face, looking for sincerity or performance. Found something in between. A career lawman realizing he'd been weaponized and trying to recover his integrity. "I'll hold you to that, Marshal." "I expect you will." Briggs turned to address the crowd. "Anyone who participated in tonight's siege should expect to answer questions. Anyone who stood by and watched should examine their conscience. This isn't over just because the judge is in custody." The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the scorched property. Smoke still rose from the cabin's ruins, mixing with evening haze to create a twilight that felt both ending and beginning. The older woman set her basket down. "We should start planning. Can't rebuild tonight, but we can organize. Figure out materials, labor, timing." Others nodded, gathering closer. Someone produced paper and pencil. Voices overlapped as people discussed lumber sources, carpentry skills, schedules. Elias stood apart, holding Miriam's letters, watching his neighbors transform violence's aftermath into something resembling community. It wasn't redemption, wasn't justice, but it was movement in the right direction. Townspeople had camped near the property overnight to ensure no retaliation occurred. Elias woke to the sound of voices and the smell of coffee. He'd slept in the barn, the only structure still standing, wrapped in blankets someone had left. His body ached in 100 places. Burns stung his hands. Smoke still clung to his lungs with every breath. But he was alive. He emerged into early morning light to find maybe 30 people already gathered. Black families from the settlement 3 miles south had arrived before dawn with wagons full of supplies. White neighbors he'd done work for over the years stood beside them, sorting through lumber and tools. A few townspeople he barely recognized had come too, drawn by guilt or curiosity or something resembling conscience. The sight stopped him at the barn door. Morning? The older black woman from last night approached with a tin cup of coffee. Figured you'd need this. Elias took it, the warmth spreading through his blistered palms. You all didn't have to. Yes, we did. Her voice was firm but not unkind. Question is whether you'll let us. He looked at the assembled group, at the pile of salvaged nails someone had already pulled from the debris, at the fresh lumber stacked beside his ruined foundation. Pride warred with exhaustion and finally surrendered. I'd be grateful for the help. The work began immediately. Men cleared the collapsed roof beams, sorting charred wood from anything salvageable. Women organized supplies, assigned tasks, prepared food. Children carried water from the well, their presence somehow transforming the scarred property into something that felt almost normal. Elias moved among them, his carpenter's eye assessing the foundation. The stone base had survived intact, his grandfather's work, built to last. The floor joists needed replacement, but the supporting posts could be reused if properly cleaned. Foundation first, he said, raising his voice to Carrie. We rebuild from the ground up. Do it right. It'll stand another 100 years. A younger black man named Isaiah, who'd watched the siege from the forest, stepped forward. I worked construction in Montgomery. Know my way around a foundation. Then you're my foreman for the morning. Elias handed him a measuring cord. Mark where the new support posts go. We'll dig footings before the sun gets too high. The work settled into rhythm. Shovels bit into earth. Hammers rang against nails. Conversations rose and fell like music. Planning, measuring, the language of building something new from what had been destroyed. Asa arrived mid-morning, still limping, his face a canvas of purple bruises. He watched the work for a long moment before approaching Elias, who was guiding a support beam into position. Didn't expect this many people, Asa said quietly. Neither did I. Elias checked the beam's alignment, nodded for the crew to secure it. But here they are. I need to ask you something. Asa's voice dropped lower. The marshal wants detailed testimony about everything that happened from the beginning. Elias straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. All right. It might take hours, and some of it will be... Asa hesitated. Some of it will require you to relive last night in detail. I understand. Elias looked at the work progressing around them. But not today. Today, I need to build. Tomorrow, then. Marshall's staying in town until we've collected statements from everyone involved. Asa shifted his weight, wincing. He's taking this seriously, Elias. More seriously than I expected. We'll see. Elias didn't fully trust it yet. Couldn't afford to. Seriousness is easy when people are watching. Real change comes when nobody's paying attention anymore. Asa nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it. He turned to survey the work crew. Some of these folks were in the mob last night. Elias followed his gaze, saw a middle-aged white man named Crawford helping dig footings. Recognized another, Thompson, carrying lumber alongside Isaiah. Men who'd held lanterns and shouted threats now worked with sweat-soaked shirts and careful hands. I know, Elias said. Question is whether they understand why they're here. Whether they're building because they're ashamed or because they actually see what was wrong. Does it matter? If the work gets done either way? Yes. Elias's voice was firm. It matters. Shame fades. Understanding lasts. Across the property, Marshal Briggs had set up a makeshift office under a canvas tent. A line of men waited to give statements, some fidgeting nervously, others stone-faced. Asa excused himself to coordinate, leaving Elias to return to the foundation work. By noon, the footings were dug and reinforced. The work crew broke for lunch, cornbread, beans, and salt pork that women had prepared over open fires. People ate in mixed groups, black and white sitting on stumps and wagon beds, conversations gradually shifting from construction to what had happened the night before. Elias heard fragments as he moved among them. Didn't know the warrant was forged. Should have questioned it sooner. Just wanted his land, didn't care who got hurt. Crawford approached while Elias was examining a stack of pine boards. The man held his hat in both hands, his face red from more than sun. "Mr. Mercer, I need to say—" His voice cracked. "I need to say I was wrong. Last night, I believed things I shouldn't have. Did things I'm ashamed of." Elias set down the board he'd been inspecting, looked at the man directly. "Why'd you believe it?" Crawford flinched at the question. "Judge said you were dangerous, said you were hiding a criminal, said we had to act before—" He stopped, realizing how hollow it sounded in daylight. "Before what?" Elias pressed. "Before I did what, exactly? Before I lived peacefully on land my family's owned for 3 generations? Before I built furniture and fixed porches and minded my own affairs? I don't know." Crawford's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know what I thought. Just got caught up in it. The anger, the fear he kept talking about." "Fear of what?" The man couldn't answer. Stood there holding his hat, shame and confusion warring on his face. "That's what you need to figure out," Elias said quietly. "Not just that you were wrong, but why you were so ready to believe it. Why a judge's word was enough to make you put on a hood and surround a man's home with 300 others. Why you didn't question it until the cabin was burning." Crawford nodded, tears in his eyes. "I'll figure it out, I promise. Then get back to work." Elias picked up the board again. "Make your amends through action, not words." The afternoon progressed with surprising efficiency. The foundation took shape. New posts secured, floor joists positioned, boards laid in careful sequence. It wouldn't be finished today or tomorrow, but the skeleton of a new home was rising from the ashes of the old. Children gathered around Elias during a water break. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, looked up at him with solemn eyes. "My papa said you were a soldier," she said. "In the war." Elias drank from his ladle, buying time. "I was. Did you fight a lot of battles?" "Some." A boy, slightly older, pressed forward. "Were you scared?" Elias considered the question seriously. "Every day. Fear keeps you alert, keeps you careful. It's what you do with fear that matters." "My uncle says the war was necessary," the girl said, "to free people who were enslaved." "Was it?" The adults had gone quiet, listening. "War is never necessary the way people claim," Elias said slowly. "But sometimes it's the only option left when talking stops working. When people in power refuse to see others as human." He looked at the children's faces, then at the adults beyond. "Some wars aren't worth repeating. The trick is learning the lessons the first time." A woman called the children back to their tasks. The work resumed. By late afternoon, the foundation stood complete. Tomorrow they'd start on walls. The day after, the roof. It would take weeks to finish properly. But the hardest part, the beginning, was done. Marshal Briggs emerged from his tent, the judge in handcuffs beside him. 2 federal deputies flanked them. A wagon waited to transport Broderick to the county seat for formal arraignment. The work site went silent as they passed. The judge kept his eyes forward, his face stony, but Elias saw the fear underneath. Saw a man who'd wielded power like a weapon, suddenly realizing the weapon had been taken away. "Mr. Mercer," the marshal paused, "I'll need that statement tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock at the sheriff's office. I'll be there." The wagon rolled away, carrying the judge toward whatever justice federal courts might provide. Whispers spread through the work crew, speculation about trials, about other arrests, about what changes might follow. Elias watched until the wagon disappeared down the road, then turned back to his rising foundation. 1 week had passed since the foundation was laid. 7 days of sawdust and sweat. 7 days of sunrise work crews and shared meals under canvas. 7 days of hammers ringing and planks settling into place, each board a small declaration that what had been destroyed could be rebuilt. Elias's new cabin stood nearly complete now. The walls were solid pine, properly sealed against weather. The roof was shingled in overlapping rows that would shed rain for decades. The porch, built wider than before, at Isaiah's suggestion, wrapped around the front and side, offering shade and a place for neighbors to gather. Inside, the space was still bare. A sleeping pallet in one corner, a simple table and 2 chairs, his tools arranged along one wall. But the structure itself was sound, strong, built by many hands working toward something better than what had come before. Each morning, Elias had risen with the sun and worked alongside whoever showed up. Some days, it was 20 people. Other days, 5. But the work continued, steady and deliberate, transforming charred ground into something new. The community had taken to calling the rebuilding effort Mercer's Stand, though Elias quietly discouraged the name. It wasn't about him, he insisted. It was about what happened when people chose to build instead of burn. Now, in the late afternoon of the 7th day, Elias stood on his new porch examining the railings Isaiah had installed. The craftsmanship was excellent. Joints fitted tight, wood planed smooth, every post vertical and true. "Beautiful work," Elias said. Isaiah, coiling rope nearby, grinned. "Learned from watching you. The way you measure twice, cut once, the way you don't rush." A wagon approached along the road. Elias recognized Sheriff Asa Dalton at the reins, his face still marked by fading bruises, but his posture stronger than it had been days ago. The federal investigators had confirmed him as acting sheriff while they conducted their review of the county's law enforcement. Asa tied his horse and climbed the porch steps carefully, testing his healing ribs. "Place looks good. Real good." Getting there, Elias gestured to one of the chairs. "Sit. You look like you need it." Asa lowered himself with a grateful sigh. "Been a long week. Between giving statements and coordinating with the marshals, I haven't slept much." "You learn anything new?" "More than I wanted to." Asa pulled a folded document from his coat. "Federal investigators finished their preliminary review. Thought you should know what they found." Elias took the document, but didn't open it yet. Waited for Asa to explain. "Judge Broderick's network was extensive," Asa said. "Forged deeds on 17 properties. Bribes to 3 county officials. The marshal, Briggs, he's petitioning for a special tribunal to review all land transactions in the county from the past 5 years. Make sure black families who were cheated get their property rights restored." Elias unfolded the paper, scanning the dense legal language, saw his own name listed among those whose land rights would be formally protected under federal oversight. "They're also recommending structural changes," Asa continued. "New oversight for local law enforcement, required transparency for land deals, regular federal audits. It won't fix everything, but it's more than I expected." "And you?" Elias asked. "What happens to you when they finish their investigation?" Asa was quiet for a moment, watching Isaiah work across the yard. "They offered me the permanent sheriff position. Said I showed courage standing up to the mob, even if I should have done it sooner." He turned to Elias. "I haven't decided yet. Part of me wonders if I deserve it. If someone who stayed silent for so long should be the one enforcing justice now." "Deserving isn't the question," Elias said. "Question is whether you'll do the work. Whether you'll stand up next time before things get to burning and bloodshed." "I will." Asa's voice was firm. "I swear it." "Then take the badge. Use it right." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of construction winding down for the day. Workers were packing tools, washing up at the water pump, preparing to head home before dark. Elias thought about the cost of the past week. His home destroyed, his body exhausted. The memories of war dragged back into the light after years of careful burial. The moment in the burning cabin when he'd nearly given up, nearly surrendered to smoke and flame rather than fight anymore. But he'd chosen to live. chosen to honor Miriam's wish for peace even when peace seemed impossible. He'd fought without killing, defended without destroying, won by refusing to become the monster they'd accused him of being. He could feel Miriam's presence in the evening air, could almost hear her voice saying what she'd told him after he came home from the war. "You survived because you stayed human. Don't forget that." He hadn't forgotten. Even with 300 lanterns circling his home and hatred pressing in from every direction, he'd remembered, had found a way to protect himself and others without adding to the violence that had already claimed too much. "You thinking about her?" Asa asked quietly. Elias nodded. "Always, but especially now," wondering if she'd be proud or disappointed. "Proud," Asa said without hesitation. "You proved something I didn't think was possible. That strength doesn't have to mean killing, that you can stand your ground without becoming what you're standing against. I had help." Elias gestured toward the cabin, toward the community that had rebuilt it. "Couldn't have done it alone. Nobody can." Asa stood slowly, testing his balance. "That's the lesson, isn't it? That we're only as strong as we are together." As the sun dropped toward the horizon, families began arriving for the evening meal. It had become tradition over the past week, sharing food on Elias's property, breaking bread together as the day's work ended. Women set out dishes on makeshift tables: cornbread, greens, roasted chicken, sweet potatoes, pies. Men arranged benches and stumps for seating. Children ran between the trees, their laughter carrying across the yard. Black families and white families, former slaves and former soldiers, people who'd been strangers a week ago now passing plates and sharing stories. Elias moved among them, greeting each person, thanking them for their labor. He paused to admire a child's drawing of the new cabin, answered an elder's question about the porch railings, listened to Crawford apologize again, more coherently this time, with understanding beginning to replace shame. The meal progressed with easy warmth. Conversations overlapped, plans for next week's work, discussions about protecting voting rights, debates about the best way to cure tobacco. Underneath it all, an unspoken agreement that what had happened here mattered, that they would not let it be forgotten, that the rebuilding meant more than wood and nails. As twilight deepened, lanterns were lit along the new fence posts. Soft, yellow light glowed against gathering darkness, gentle and welcoming instead of threatening. The contrast to that night 1 week ago was absolute. Children settled near the porch to listen as elders discussed what came next. Talk of formal protections for black landowners, unity meetings between communities, petitions to ensure federal oversight continued beyond the current investigation. Hope tempered with realism, but hope nonetheless. Elias sat in his chair on the finished porch, watching it all unfold, the lanterns glowing peacefully, the families gathered in conversation, the home rebuilt stronger than before. Asa joined him one last time before leaving. "You did something remarkable here, Elias." "We did," Elias corrected. "All of us together." After Asa departed, after the families began heading home with promises to return tomorrow, Elias remained on his porch. The night was quiet now, except for crickets and distant owls. He thought about the war, about Miriam, about the man he'd been and the man he'd chosen to become, about 300 lanterns that had meant to destroy him, but had instead revealed something stronger than hatred. The last lantern flickered in the yard. Stars emerged overhead, bright and clear. Elias spoke quietly to the darkness, to Miriam's memory, to himself. "Some wars you win by refusing to fight the way they want you to." The words settled into the night like a benediction, a truth earned through fire and restraint, a new stability built not on violence, but on the harder work of choosing peace when war would have been easier. He sat there as full darkness came, watching over his rebuilt home and the community that had made it possible, knowing the real victory was this: he had survived without losing himself. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.